The laws of nature broke. Atoms split beneath them. Magic engulfed the continent in a cataclysm, killing those unseen remaining and obliterating a large part of the Yokudan population. With that, the foundations of Yokuda were broken, and the continent sank beneath the waves, leaving only a fraction of their islands, and all their cities to be wiped from the face of the earth. Yokuda was gone. What could destroy an entire continent in an instant? And why would an order of holy warriors and scholars turn on their people with such a vicious vengeance? This is part 1 of the story of Yokuda and the Sword Singers. The continent of Yokuda, much like the Redguard homeland of Hammerfell, was a diverse, varied, but often hostile landscape. It was made up of a great many islands called Samara. It was low, lush, welcoming, with many harbours, warm and sweet with fruit. Kanesh, it was tall, volcanic, harsh, but strong and blazing within a heat. There was Yath, which was jagged and rugged, magnificent with clear views from a spine like steel. And there was Akos Kasaz, biggest of them all, ruler and rebel, moody and many-sided, gentle and brutal. And among the Yokudans lived a powerful warrior order known as the Sword Singers, the greatest of which among them were known as the Unsee. Seriously, these guys are like the freaking Jedi Order, and I had no idea how much I wanted to play them until I read up about their lore. They wandered the countryside, righting wrongs, defeating monsters, performing quests in the name of virtue. They were as much scholars and philosophers as they were warriors, and they developed the martial philosophy of the blade. These Sword Singers, or the Unsee, wielded a weapon called the Shahai, supernatural blades constructed out of sheer force of will, and a weapon that can never be taken from the owner without also taking his mind. They had such a mastery of it that we have stories of them deflecting arrows in midair, closing tears in the fabric of reality of space and time, cutting through stone like it was water, and breaking magical armor with a single blow. But these powers listed here are far from their most dangerous ability, an ability that caused the absolute destruction of their home continent, the Pankratov Sword. It was a rare ability unlike any other, that only the most powerful of the Unsee could master and wield, and even then, it usually meant death for them. In Lord Vivek's sword meeting with Cyrus the Restless, a Redguard hero, it is written that, when we fight, our swords can kill the laws of nature itself. Yokuda is as you see it because of our Hiradirg swords that can cut the Atomos, the uncuttable, and we did. Kill the laws of nature itself and cut the Atomos. Atomos here likely meaning atoms. This is the sort of level of power that we're dealing with here, and the Masters of the Shahai had an array of powers, but the Pankratov Sword would allow them to create magical nuclear explosions of some kind, to manipulate and undermine the very laws of nature itself. We do not know the true extent of this power, but Vivek notes that it would certainly kill Cyrus if he were to use it, and he actually feared it. It was so powerful and so ancient that not even he knew how it worked. Now, this is the only source that we have that speaks of the Pankratov Sword directly, and it is an out-of-game source, but it was written by Michael Kirkbride, a major figure in the Elder Scrolls lore community. However, even so, there are a number of sources in-game that talk about this ability, this technique, indirectly. One account of the destruction of Yokuda records that others suggest that it may have had human origins, a band of Unsee called the Hiradirg, who are said to be masters of stone magic. Stone magic, well, what could that mean? Were they able to sink an entire continent with their Shahai? It's also notable that this faction of the Unsee called themselves the Hiradirg, which is exactly the name that Cyrus used when describing the type of blade that he could use to perform the Pankratov Sword with. Well, for a long time, the idea that the Sword Singers sunk Yokuda was a loose theory, but we have something of a confirmation of it in the battle with the warrior constellation in the Elder Scrolls Online. He cries out very clearly that the Shahai of a first rank Unsee sank Yokuda. This warrior's Shahai is beyond first rank. So the mythical blade of the Unsee, a Shahai, sunk Yokuda. Not only does this tell us that they did it, but that it only required one of them, or at least the phrasing suggests that. I can only imagine the Pankratov Sword technique being an ability strong enough to do so, killing the laws of nature, cutting atoms in half, destroying the earthy foundations of the continent and allowing it to sink into the ocean. But it begs the question, why? Why would this group of sword singers who went about defeating monsters, protecting the common people, guarded by their code of ethics, why would they turn on their people and their homeland with such a vengeance? Well, the story goes back centuries. The fall of Yokuda truly began in the year 376 of the First Era, when the traditional ruling royal line of emperors was overthrown. Since that time, our people have seen 300 years of almost continuous civil war between provincial lords, warrior monks, and brigands, all fighting each other for land and power. It was chaos, and the life of man was nasty, brutish, and short. But prior to this period of Yokuda descending into civil war, its people had been full of artisans, poets, scholars. This continental strife forced their academics into a world of war, and it was in the flame of battle that the sword singers rose to prominence. A group of people who would mix swordsmanship with poetry and philosophy, and they would become the Ansi, the sword singers. We'll be talking a lot more about their philosophy and their way of life and how their shahai actually worked in the second video in this series. Now, some sources date the beginning of the sword singers to this period of civil war, while other sources suggest that the real sword singers didn't truly begin until the year 720 of the First Era, with the birth of one of the greatest warriors to have ever lived, Frendar Hunding. In the time of Frendar, the Ansi wandered the countryside, righting wrongs, defeating monsters, performing quests in the name of virtue, and the people thanked them. They saw them as their protectors. Also, I should note that the Ansi were really just the elite of the sword singers. There were sword singers who didn't have the ability to summon a shahai, and they were just standard sword singers. But they really rose to prominence when Frendar Hunding led a campaign to defeat Lord Janek and his 7 lich followers. And this was because the Redguards have always hated the undead, and they especially hate those who raised them. By the age of 30, Frendar was virtually invincible, and he used his shahai to kill monsters, brigands, and protect the common people. They looked up to him as a leader and for protection, and by the age of 30, Frendar retired. He became a hermit to write the sacred text of the sword singers, the Book of Circles, that we'll be talking a lot more about in next video. We'll be talking about their philosophy and what that book actually says. So for a time there was this amicable relationship between the sword singers and their fellow Yokudans, but this would not last forever. In fact, there was always tension of a kind between the sword singers and the common peoples, because prior to Frendar Hunding, they had mostly been drawn from the ruling and upper class, those who knew and understood art and philosophy. That's what they mixed with their swordsmanship. This meant that there was a natural class divide of education and wealth between the commoners and the sword singers, and this only worsened in 617 of the First Era when a commoner took over the government, Randik Torn. He revived the old gulf between the warriors, the sword singers, and the commoners by introducing restrictions on the wearing of swords. Only the singers were allowed to wear swords, which distinguished them from the rest of the population. This move singled them out amongst the others, and the rift only began to widen as they began to resent the sword singers. The sword singers in turn felt persecuted. They would be ridiculed and cast out of towns, and the commoners felt that they were elitist, aloof. Soon enough, some of the Ansi began to turn away from the interests of commoners, no longer protecting them, as they felt that they were being repeatedly disrespected and unfairly cast aside. This, of course, made things only worse. These tensions culminated in the War of the Singers near the end of Frendar Hunding's life. The last Emperor Hera began the last great strife of the Desert Empire, hoping to destroy the sword singers. Hera vowed to search out every singer with his brigand army composed of orcs and cast-offs of the wars of the Empire, and to scourge them from the face of the planet. Interestingly, this is one of the few references that we have to orcs being on Yokuda, and one theory is that they were the legendary left-handed elves that we hear occasionally mentioned. The elves that the Yokudans literally genocided off the face of the earth. They wiped them out entirely. Otherwise, it was just badly recorded history. But it is nice to think that there could have been this other civilization of orcs on this other continent. It was the year 780 of the First Era, and Frendar Hunding was 60 years old when this War of the Singers broke out. It began when the last emperor ascended to power and began to persecute the sword singers. Devard, the son of Frandar Hunding, was among the first to attract his attention. He moved swiftly against the singers who were visibly part of Empire society, those in the government running their businesses, those that the populace recognized. He sent a team of 100 of his personal guards to arrest Devard, for even an unarmed singer was a very dangerous foe. And though they initially managed to capture him, he eventually broke free, and he used his chains to kill the guards before vanishing into the night. He sought out his father, Frandar, whom he hated for abandoning him, but he sparked the rebellion. He knew that they needed to unite. Taking the helm of leadership, Frandar Hunding funneled the enemy into 7 battles in a strategy that he called the Hammer and the Anvil. He drew them further and further into the desert, where they knew the landscape and Hera's armies didn't, right to the foot of Mount Hatu, the father of all mountains. Battle after battle, the singers and the commoners grew to think of one another as enemies more than one people. Hunding fought 6 battles in this, in which he learned and studied the strategies of Hera's forces, but each time he would withdraw, so there would be no victor and no loser. Then on the 7th battle, he turned the tides and they stood their ground. They outnumbered them 30-1, but the singers never faltered from the way. Hera and his army maneuvered to the base of Hatu Mountain, where the hammer blow was delivered. The battle was pitched, and many singers fell that day. Hunding knew that the singers who lived would be only a few, but Hera and his evil empire would not live, and so it went. At the end, Hunding and less than 20,000 singers survived the day. More than 300,000 had fallen on that day at Hatu. Of those who were left to run and live, all were scattered to the 4 winds. An organised force no more. This war absolutely destroyed the Sword Singers. It left their cities in desolation, and it left their people scattered. It left Yokudan society fractured. The bitterness remained. For all they had done for the common people, they had turned on them like that. The Sword Singers felt that they were no longer welcome. They had no place in Yokudan society, and the Unsea did not believe that the common people deserved their protection anymore. The commoners had little regard for the way and cared not about the reasons for their own salvation. They needed a home of their own, away from these other people who did not respect or understand them. So many of them left. They called themselves the Redguard. One day they would be called the Redguards, that we all know, and they sailed east from Yokuda to Hammerfell, to begin a new life for themselves. Even so, a small faction of the Unsea remained behind, and they called themselves the Hiradirj, and they did not forget the atrocities that had been committed against them. They were bitter, either in vengeance for how they were treated, bitterness for how they were unable to rule Yokuda themselves, thinking themselves better and more wise than those like Hera. An unknown Unsea wielded their shahai and performed this deadly, cataclysmic technique, the Pankratov Sword. The laws of nature broke, atoms split beneath them. Magic engulfed the continent in a cataclysm, killing those Unsea remaining and obliterating a large part of the Yokudan population. With that, the foundations of Yokuda were broken, and the continent sank beneath the waves, leaving only a fraction of their islands, and all their cities to be wiped from the face of the earth. Yokuda was gone. While the Unsea would continue on in Hammerfell for some time, the way of the Shahai would eventually be lost by the Second Era. People simply forgot about the ancient ways. It wasn't needed anymore. But that technique, the Pankratov Sword, died on that day in 792 of the First Era. Cyrus, you see, never knew how to actually use the Pankratov Sword. Its use was forbidden and thus held in no memory at all after the fall of Old Yokuda. It had been entirely forgotten. And that may have been what destroyed Yokuda. In the second part, we'll be taking a closer look at the Sword Singers themselves, their philosophy, the Book of Circles, Frandar Hunding, and the exact power of the Shahai. Question of the day: what is one common historical misconception that you wish people didn't really believe? So one thing that's sort of become a bit apparent to me as I've did that video on religious world building is that a lot of people think that Ares was the patron god of Sparta. That's just not true. It was actually Athena, technically, but they worshipped Apollo a lot more. But they did revere Ares at the same time. If you'd like to support the channel, if you enjoy this sort of content, then feel free to come support me over on the Patreon Discord. You can talk with me. There's lots of Elder Scrolls content stuff going on. Get background information on how the channel's going and everything. It's always good conversations. Otherwise, please come follow me over on all of my social media, Twitter, Facebook, otherwise email me stuff that you made, address and links in the description below. I will see you tomorrow with another video on the Elder Scrolls. I'm really looking forward to that. There was way too much content to just put into one, so I decided to split it up into two. I'll see you then, and until then, stay nerdy, Subfuries, and I'll see you in the future.